Ever undertaken is often reduced to a few paragraphs in a textbook. Brace yourself, because we're stepping onto the slave ships of the Middle Passage to confront the raw, unvarnished truth of a struggle for survival against unimaginable odds. You think you know history? What if I told you that one of the most inhumane journeys is? The story begins not on the ships but deep within the heart of Africa, in villages where laughter once filled the air, where mothers sang to their children under the moonlight, where the rhythm of drums told stories of love, courage, and ancestry. Life was vibrant, rooted in tradition and family, but in the blink of an eye that life could be shattered. The slave raiders came not as whispers, but as storms. The abduction. It was never a war, but a raid. Armed men descended upon sleeping, villages, torches in hand, shattering the calm of night. Screams pierced the air as families were ripped apart. Homes set ablaze, and those who tried to flee were hunted down. Fathers were slain trying to protect their wives and children. Young men, strong and fit, were bound and dragged away, while women and children were beaten, chained, and forced into long, excruciating marches toward the coast. Each step was a step away from freedom, each mile a deeper descent into despair. The air grew heavier with each passing day, not from heat alone, but from the weight of uncertainty. Many never survived the march. Those who stumbled were whipped or left behind to die. The sound of chains clinking became the new rhythm of life, and the road to the unknown felt endless. Inside these factories of no return, humanity was stripped layer by layer. Mothers wept for their lost children. Husbands called out for wives who would never answer. People from different tribes who once might have seen each other as strangers or even enemies, now shared the same chain, the same fate. And slowly, they began to understand that they were no longer captives of rival tribes. They were commodities in a trade that saw them as less than human. That realization carried a pain that words cannot fully capture. When they finally reached the coast, what awaited them wasn't deliverance. It was another kind of prison. European outposts known as factories dotted the shoreline, not places of production but of waiting, suffering, and broken spirits. Here captives were held in stone dungeons, often for weeks or months, as traders negotiated prices for human lives. The smell of salt mixed with sweat, blood, and rot. The sun beat down mercilessly on those chained in courtyards while others languished in darkness, barely able to breathe. They could hear the ocean, the sound of waves crashing, but the sea was no promise of freedom. It was the barrier between them and everything they had ever known. The darkness below deck was absolute. The air thickened with heat, sweat, urine, and sickness. The stench was unbearable, so suffocating that even sailors sometimes gagged when they opened the hatches. The moans of the dying blended with the whispers of the living. Some prayed in their own tongues, others simply stared into nothingness. The iron rubbed their skin raw, leaving open wounds that festered in the heat. Each breath became a battle. Then came the day of loading. The day when they were herded like cargo onto ships built not for transport of goods, but for the mass confinement of souls. The slave ship, a vessel of horror, a floating coffin on the endless sea. Each one was designed with precision, not for comfort, not even for survival, but for profit. Every inch of space was calculated to hold as many human bodies as possible. Men were packed shoulder to shoulder, shackled together with iron chains. Women were forced below or kept near the deck for the crew's use, their cries muffled by the roar of the waves. Children lay between adults, too weak to cry for long. Disease spread quickly. Dysentery, smallpox, fever. Each day more bodies grew still. The dead were unchained and thrown overboard, their splashes marking the end of one suffering and the beginning of another. But sometimes the living were thrown too, those deemed too weak to survive, discarded like waste. Sharks learned to follow the slave ships, their fins slicing through the waves, waiting for their grim feast. Sailors called it the shark's trail. The screams were constant, from pain, from loss, from the horror of realization. Those who resisted were beaten. Those who refused to eat were forced, their mouths pried open with metal tools, food jammed down their throats. Every cry was met with a whip, every show of defiance with a chain. The sound of the ocean outside, that endless mocking rhythm, was the only reminder that the world still existed beyond that floating tomb. And yet amidst this hell, there was something that even chains could not destroy, the will to resist. Beneath the decks, whispers spread, whispers of rebellion, of throwing themselves into the sea rather than endure. There were moments when the enslaved rose up, seizing weapons or breaking free of their chains, trying to take control of the ship. Some succeeded briefly before being slaughtered. Others jumped into the water, choosing the deep blue over the life of bondage. The crew called them mad, but for those who leapt, the sea was not death. It was freedom. For those who lived, survival was not living, it was enduring. The women bore a pain that went beyond the physical. Many were violated repeatedly, their dignity stripped as part of the routine cruelty that defined these voyages. The men, forced to listen, could do nothing but weep in silence. The ship was a world without mercy, where every day blurred into another night of agony. Yet every act of survival, every breath taken was resistance. The Middle Passage was designed to crush the human spirit, to erase identity, culture, and hope. But despite everything, the enslaved carried pieces of themselves across the ocean, their songs, their faith, their stories. These fragments of memory became the last defense against total annihilation. For some, death came as mercy. For others, survival was a curse wrapped in endurance. And as the coastline of the New World finally appeared, faint and distant on the horizon, none could yet imagine what awaited them there. The chains would not fall away. They would simply be replaced by new ones, forged in fields and plantations. The dancing ritual became another cruel mockery. To keep the captives alive and valuable, the enslavers forced them onto the deck to exercise. Whips cracked as music played, forcing broken bodies to move to rhythms of pain. The enslavers saw it as maintenance. The enslaved knew it was torment. Some danced not out of obedience but as defiance, stomping the deck not for their captors but for their ancestors. But the human spirit, even when shackled and starved, does not die easily. Beneath the deck, where the air was foul and thick, small acts of resistance continued. Sometimes the enslaved refused food, a silent rebellion, a choice to die on their own terms. Others found ways to communicate through song or rhythm, tapping faint beats on the wood, sharing strength through coded messages of endurance. It was in those rhythms that resistance lived, disguised as despair yet defiant at its core. By the time the slave ships reached the open sea, time had lost all meaning. Days and nights blended into one long, suffocating nightmare. Below deck, the enslaved clung to the faintest thread of life. Some whispering prayers in tongues foreign to the sailors, others staring blankly into darkness that seemed endless. Each day was the same battle, a fight to breathe, to endure, to stay human in a world that had declared them less than that. Then there were the throwaways. That was the cruel term used for the sick, the weak, and the dying, people who no longer had value. If disease spread, captains ordered the ill to be thrown into the ocean, alive or dead, to protect the rest of the cargo. Mothers screamed as their children were ripped from their arms and cast into the sea. The sound of splashing water became a symbol of horror, a rhythm of death marking the ship's slow progress across the Atlantic. Some sailors even collected insurance for those who died in transport. To them, human life had a price tag, and the ocean became the graveyard of millions. The captains and crew called it managing the cargo. They saw human beings as inventory, numbered, weighed, and priced. But they feared one thing: rebellion. And rebellion did come. On some voyages, the enslaved rose up in desperate fury. Chains became weapons, iron cuffs, tools of vengeance. Men and women fought side by side against their captors, willing to die for the chance to touch freedom once more. Blood stained the decks, both black and white mingling in the chaos. Few revolts succeeded, but every one of them sent a message that even in total bondage, the will to fight back could not be extinguished. When at last land appeared on the horizon, it did not bring relief, only a new kind of terror. They had survived the ocean, but now faced a lifetime of servitude in a strange and hostile world. As the ships anchored near the ports of the Americas, the enslaved were brought up to the deck, blinking against the light of day. Their bodies bore the marks of chains, their eyes hollow from exhaustion, but they were still alive. And that was something their captors could never fully understand. For the enslaved who survived, survival itself was an act of resistance. Some whispered prayers to gods of their homeland, invoking spirits for protection. Others shared bits of memory, the name of a mother, a village, a song, determined not to let their history vanish. They found strength in one another, building fragile bonds in the darkness. Women often became the quiet pillars of endurance. They nursed the weak, whispered words of comfort to the dying. and bore the pain of violation with unimaginable grace. Beneath the surface of horror, they carried a fire, and not of rage, but of survival. Freedom once existed, and might exist again. Survival against all odds. That was their legacy. Through shared suffering, the enslaved found connection that transcended tribe, language, and nation. They were no longer simply Akan, Igbo, Yoruba, or Mandinka. They had become something new, a people forged in fire and salt water, united by pain and endurance. The women in particular became the unseen foundation of survival. They carried new generations, often born into bondage, yet raised with whispers of strength, quiet reminders that, stepping onto the docks, they entered the next chapter of their captivity. They were washed, inspected, and sold at auctions where their humanity was further erased. Families who had survived the ship together were torn apart again, sold to different masters, never to see each other again. Yet even here, beneath the lash and the weight of oppression, the spirit of resistance continued. Through language, music, and faith, they rebuilt fragments of what had been destroyed. Every song sung in the fields, every whispered prayer was a rebellion, a refusal to forget who they were. As the decades passed, the trauma of the Middle Passage did not fade. It embedded itself in generations. It was a wound carried in bloodlines, in memory and silence. But out of that pain grew cultures of strength and creativity. New languages, music, and traditions that told the story of survival against impossible odds. From the sorrow of the Middle Passage came the blues, the gospel, the stories of endurance that shaped the African diaspora. What began as a tragedy became the foundation of resilience that still echoes today. On the plantations of the New World, their resilience continued. They learned to survive under masters' eyes, to hide their defiance in plain sight. They worked, obeyed, endured. But within, they plotted, they remembered, they hoped. Songs carried coded messages. Prayers disguised resistance. Even in submission, there was strategy. The enslaved learned the art of survival as resistance, and women became its keepers, healers, protectors, and transmitters of strength. The legacy of the Middle Passage is not just history. It is living memory. It shaped nations, cultures, and identities across the Americas. It reminds us that the story of slavery is not one of submission, but of resistance, of people who endured what should have been unendurable and still found ways to create, to love, to hope. Even centuries later, the ghosts of the Middle Passage have not disappeared. The ocean that swallowed so many still holds their whispers beneath its waves. Every ripple carries an echo of chains of prayers, of screams lost to time. Historians estimate that millions perished during the journey, their bodies never buried, their names never recorded. Yet their legacy is not in their deaths. It's in the survival of those who lived, those who carried memory across the sea and refused to let it die. We remember them not as numbers in ledgers or statistics in history books, but as mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters, as people who lived, loved, and dreamed. Their screams may have faded from the air, but their courage still echoes across time. Today, when we speak their names, we do not mourn them as victims alone. We honor them as survivors, warriors who faced humanity's darkest hour and emerged scarred but unbroken. Their journey from the shores of Africa to the plantations of the New World was a journey through hell, but also a testament to the human spirit's unyielding power. And as the waves crash endlessly against the shores of history, they whisper the same truth, that even in the darkest depths of despair, the human spirit refuses to drown. Because every breath of freedom that exists today carries a trace of their endurance. Every act of justice, every call for equality is an answer to their suffering. The Middle Passage was not just a journey of chains. It was the birth of a resilience so deep that it still shapes our world centuries later.